The ship came down from the sky on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. It was big and silver and shaped like nothing anyone on Earth had ever seen before. It landed in the middle of the New Mexico desert without making a sound. The sand did not blow. The air did not move. It simply appeared, as if it had always been there. Jake Harris was eating a sandwich when he got the call. He was 34 years old, and he worked for the United Nations in a department that most people did not know existed. His job was to prepare for something that everyone hoped would never happen, and everyone secretly believed would happen someday. First contact with alien life. Now it was happening, and Jake put down his sandwich and drove 3 hours to reach the landing site. The area was already surrounded by military vehicles and government people in dark suits. But the aliens did not seem to care about any of them. They had asked for one thing only. They wanted to speak with someone who understood survival, someone who knew how to stay alive when everything was trying to kill them. That was why they called Jake. He had spent 3 winters in Alaska teaching Air Force pilots how to survive if their planes went down in frozen places. He had slept in snow caves and walked across frozen lakes and learned from people who had lived in the cold for thousands of years. The aliens had done their research. They knew exactly who they wanted to talk to. The inside of the alien ship was warm and smelled like flowers that Jake could not name. The walls were smooth and white and seemed to glow from within. He was led down a long hallway by a creature that walked on 4 legs and had skin like polished wood. It did not speak. It simply walked, and Jake followed. The meeting room was round and empty except for a single table and 2 chairs. One chair was normal and human-sized. The other was tall and thin, built for a body that was not human at all. The alien who sat in that chair was called Ambassador Nira. She was tall, almost 7 feet, with silver blue skin and 4 arms that moved like water when she spoke. Her eyes were large and dark and filled with something that looked almost like sadness. She explained everything in a voice that was soft and musical. There was a galactic community out there among the stars. Thousands of species on thousands of worlds, all connected by trade and treaties and shared knowledge. But joining this community was not easy. Every species had to prove itself worthy. Every species had to pass a test. The test was called the Trial of Worth. It had been created long ago by a species called the Architects. No one knew who the Architects were or where they had gone. They had disappeared millions of years before any current species had learned to walk upright. But they had left behind their testing chambers, spread across the galaxy like ancient monuments. And they had left behind their rules. Any species that wanted to join the galactic community had to enter the chambers and complete the trials. There were many trials, each one designed to test a different quality: strength, intelligence, cooperation, endurance. Most species passed most of the trials without too much trouble. But there was one trial that no species had ever passed. It was called the Ice Trial. Ambassador Nira leaned forward as she explained this part. Her 4 hands folded together on the table. The ice trial was simple in concept. The participants would be placed in a chamber that was cold beyond imagination. The temperature would drop to -60 degrees. There would be no technology, no tools, no weapons. The chamber would provide only one thing: ice, snow, frozen water in every form. The participants had to survive for 90 hours. That was all. Just survive. 47 species had attempted the ice trial over the past 12,000 years. 47 species had failed. The Velkari came from worlds of fire and lava. They were creatures of heat and flame, and they had tried to generate warmth through constant movement. They ran and jumped and pushed their bodies to the limit. They lasted 9 minutes before they collapsed from exhaustion and froze to death. The Drenith were massive beings with thick hides and layers of fat beneath their skin. They were built for endurance. Built to withstand harsh conditions, they huddled together in groups and tried to share their body heat. They lasted 2 hours before the cold crept through their defenses and stopped their hearts. The Sith were made of living crystal. They did not breathe or eat or sleep in the way that other species did. They tried to absorb energy from the walls of the chamber, to pull warmth from the ancient machines that surrounded them. But there was no warmth to pull. The Sith grew brittle and cracked. They shattered like glass dropped on stone. Every species had tried, every species had failed, and now it was humanity's turn. Jake sat in silence for a long moment after Ambassador Nira finished speaking. He thought about Alaska. He thought about the long nights when the temperature dropped so low that spit would freeze before it hit the ground. He thought about the people who had taught him to survive in places where survival seemed impossible. He asked what would happen if humanity failed. Ambassador Nira's dark eyes grew even sadder. If humanity failed, Earth would be quarantined. No trade, no contact, no help if disaster struck, no warning if danger approached. Humanity would be alone in the universe forever, locked away on their single small planet like prisoners in a cell they did not know existed. Jake asked what would happen if humanity succeeded. For the first time, something like hope flickered across Ambassador Nira's face. If humanity succeeded, they would be welcomed into the galactic community as full members. They would have access to technology and knowledge and resources beyond anything they had ever imagined. They would have allies among the stars. But more than that, Ambassador Nira said, more than that, they would be the first species ever to pass the ice trial, the first to prove that it could be done. Jake looked at his hands. They were rough and calloused from years of hard work in hard places. He thought about his team back home. He thought about Lisa, who had lived with Arctic communities and learned their ancient ways. He thought about Sam, who could build anything from nothing and never lost his cool, no matter how bad things got. He looked up at Ambassador Nira and asked one final question. When do we start? The news spread across the world in a matter of hours. Aliens were real. They had come to Earth, and they wanted humanity to take a test. The United Nations held emergency meetings that lasted for days. Presidents and prime ministers argued over video calls. Scientists debated what the ice trial might involve. Military leaders wanted to send soldiers. Politicians wanted to send diplomats. Everyone had an opinion about who should represent the entire human species in a test that no other species had ever passed. Jake sat in a small room in New York City and waited for them to make up their minds. He had already given his recommendation. He had told them exactly who he thought should go. Now all he could do was wait and hope they would listen. On the 6th day, they called him back into the main chamber. The decision had been made. 3 people would enter the ice trial. 3 people would carry the hopes of 8 billion human beings on their shoulders. Jake Harris would lead the team. His experience in Arctic survival and his connection with the aliens made him the obvious choice. He had already proven that he could stay calm under pressure. He had already shown that he understood what they were facing. The second member would be Lisa Monroe. She was 31 years old, an anthropologist who had spent her career studying how different cultures survived in extreme environments. But more importantly, she had lived with Inuit communities in northern Canada for 2 years. She had learned their ways. She had built igloos with her own hands. She had eaten raw seal meat and slept on beds of ice and walked across frozen oceans in the endless winter night. If anyone understood how to live in the cold, it was Lisa. The third member was a surprise to everyone except Jake. His name was Sam Reyes, and he was 29 years old. He was an engineer from a small town in Minnesota, and on paper he did not seem special at all. He had no military training. He had no survival certifications. He had never been on television or written any books. But Jake had met Sam 3 years earlier during a training exercise in northern Minnesota. A group of engineers had been testing cold weather equipment when a storm hit and trapped them in the wilderness for 4 days. Most of the engineers had panicked. Some had cried. One had tried to walk out alone and nearly died. Sam had done none of those things. Sam had simply looked at the situation, figured out what needed to be done, and started doing it. He had built a shelter from fallen branches. He had started a fire using a technique his grandfather had taught him when he was a boy. He had kept everyone calm and warm and alive until the rescue teams arrived. When Jake asked him later how he had stayed so calm, Sam had shrugged and said that panicking never fixed anything. Getting upset just wasted energy. The only thing that mattered was figuring out the next step and taking it. That was the kind of person they needed for the ice trial, not someone who would fight the cold, not someone who would rage against the impossible. They needed someone who would simply look at the problem and start solving it, one step at a time. The three of them met for the first time as a team in a secure facility in Colorado. They had 2 weeks to prepare before the aliens would take them to the testing chamber. Lisa spread out photographs and diagrams on a large table. She showed them pictures of igloos, the dome-shaped shelters that Arctic peoples had built for thousands of years. She explained how they worked, how the curved walls trapped body heat, how the entrance tunnels kept cold air from flowing in, how a well-built igloo could be 50 or 60 degrees warmer inside than the frozen world outside. Sam listened carefully and asked questions. He wanted to know about the structure. He wanted to understand the engineering. He built small models out of sugar cubes and tested how much weight they could hold. Jake focused on the human element. He talked about how cold affected the body. He explained how hypothermia crept in slowly, how it confused the mind and slowed the muscles. He taught them the warning signs to watch for. He made them practice working together, communicating clearly, trusting each other completely. At night, they sat together and talked about their lives. Lisa told them about the Inuit elders who had taught her their ways. She spoke about a woman named Mary who had lived to be 93 years old and had never once been warm in the way that people in southern places understood warmth. Mary had told her that cold was not an enemy. Cold was just a fact. The enemy was fear. The enemy was giving up. Sam talked about his grandfather, a quiet man who had fished on frozen lakes his entire life. His grandfather had taught him patience. He had taught him that nature did not care about human schedules or human desires. You could not rush a fish to bite. You could not rush a fire to start. You had to work with the world as it was, not as you wished it would be. Jake talked about Alaska. He talked about pilots who had crashed in the wilderness and survived for weeks with nothing but their wits and their will. He talked about the ones who did not survive and what had gone wrong for them. Usually, it was not the cold that killed them. Usually, it was panic. It was bad decisions made in moments of fear. It was giving up when things looked hopeless. The three of them made a promise to each other. No matter what happened in that chamber, they would not panic. They would not give up. They would take each moment as it came and do whatever needed to be done. On the last night before they left Earth, Sam went for a walk outside the facility. The Colorado sky was clear and full of stars. He stood in the darkness and looked up at all those distant points of light. Somewhere out there, other beings were watching. Other species were waiting to see what humanity would do. Sam thought about his grandfather. He thought about sitting in a small wooden shack on a frozen lake, waiting for fish that might never come. He thought about the patience and the silence and the deep peace of those cold winter mornings. He was not afraid. The next morning, they boarded the alien ship and left Earth behind. The ice trial was waiting. The journey through space took 3 days. The alien ship moved faster than anything humans had ever built, crossing distances that would have taken human spacecraft thousands of years. Jake and Lisa and Sam spent most of that time resting and preparing their minds for what was coming. Ambassador Nira visited them on the second day. She brought food and water and something else. Information. She told them that the ice trial would be broadcast across the galaxy. Thousands of species on thousands of worlds would be watching. Some would be hoping that humans succeeded. Many would be expecting them to fail, just like everyone else had failed. The Velkari had placed bets that the humans would not last 20 minutes. The Drenith had given them an hour at most. Lisa asked why so many species wanted them to fail. Ambassador Nira's four arms moved in a gesture that might have been a shrug. It was not that they wanted humans to fail, she explained. It was that failure was all they had ever known. 47 species had entered the ice trial. 47 species had died. After 12,000 years of watching others freeze, it was hard to imagine any other outcome. But Nira herself was different. She had watched the recordings of the humans preparing. She had seen how they worked together. She had noticed something that other species had not shown. They were not afraid of the cold. They were not treating it like an enemy to be defeated. They were treating it like a puzzle to be solved. On the morning of the third day, the ship arrived at the architect's station. It was enormous, a structure the size of a small moon floating in empty space, far from any star. The station was old beyond measure, built by beings who had vanished before the first dinosaurs walked on Earth. Its systems still worked perfectly after millions of years. The architects had built things to last. The testing chamber was located deep inside the station. Jake and Lisa and Sam walked down long corridors of smooth white stone, past doorways that led to other trials that other species had passed or failed. The air grew colder as they walked. By the time they reached the entrance to the ice trial chamber, their breath was forming small clouds in front of their faces. The door was massive, 30 feet tall and made of a metal that gleamed like frozen silver. Ancient symbols were carved into its surface, a language that no living being could read. Ambassador Nira stopped at the door and turned to face them. Her dark eyes were filled with something that looked almost like tears. She told them that once they entered, she could not help them. The rules of the trial were absolute, no outside assistance. No communication. They would be alone with the cold for 90 hours. She wished them luck, though she admitted that she did not really believe in luck. She believed in preparation and determination and the will to survive, and she had seen all three of those things in the humans standing before her. The door opened. Cold air rushed out like a living thing, biting at their exposed skin. Beyond the doorway was a vast chamber filled with ice and snow and nothing else. No furniture, no equipment, no shelter, just frozen white emptiness stretching out in every direction. Jake took a deep breath of the freezing air. He looked at Lisa. He looked at Sam. Then he stepped through the door. The cold hit him like a physical blow. It was worse than anything he had experienced in Alaska. Worse than the coldest nights he had ever survived. The temperature was 60 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, cold enough to kill an unprotected human in less than an hour. Lisa and Sam followed him through, and the door closed behind them with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. For a moment, the three of them just stood there, letting their bodies adjust to the shock. Small drones floated near the ceiling, recording everything for the watching galaxy. Thousands of alien species were seeing this moment, waiting to watch another species fail. Sam was the first to speak. His voice was calm and steady, as if he was standing in a warm room rather than a frozen death trap. He said that they needed to find the right kind of snow for building. Not all snow was the same. Some was too light and powdery. Some was too wet and heavy. They needed snow that would pack together firmly, snow that would hold its shape when carved into blocks. Lisa was already moving, testing the snow beneath her feet. She pressed her hands into different patches, feeling the texture, checking the density. After a few minutes, she found what she was looking for, a section of firmly packed snow near the center of the chamber. Perfect for building. They began to work. The watchers across the galaxy did not understand what they were seeing at first. The humans were cutting blocks out of the snow, carving them with their bare hands, stacking them in a circle on the ground. It looked like madness. It looked like they were building a wall around themselves, using the very thing that was supposed to kill them. Jake worked on cutting the blocks. He used his hands to score the snow, then broke off rectangular pieces and passed them to Sam. His fingers grew numb quickly, but he kept warming them against his body and then returning to work. Sam arranged the blocks in a spiral pattern, each one angled slightly inward, each row smaller than the one below it. Lisa packed snow into the gaps between blocks, sealing them tight against the wind. The structure rose slowly, curving inward toward a central point. 6 hours passed. The humans kept working. Their movements became slower as the cold seeped into their muscles, but they did not stop. They took turns resting inside the partially completed structure, while the others continued building. By the 8th hour, the igloo was finished. It was a perfect dome of packed snow, about 10 feet across at the base, with a small tunnel entrance that curved downward before rising into the interior. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a pile of snow. From the inside, it was a miracle of engineering. Jake crawled through the entrance tunnel and into the main chamber. The difference was immediate. The wind was gone. The bitter edge of the cold was gone. The curved walls reflected his body heat back toward him, and the packed snow above his head trapped the warmth inside. Lisa and Sam followed him in. The three of them sat together in their small shelter, breathing hard from the work, watching the walls around them begin to glisten as the interior temperature climbed. Outside, it was still 60 below zero. Inside the igloo, the temperature had already risen to just below freezing, and it was still climbing. The watching galaxy fell silent. No species had ever done anything like this. No species had ever thought to use the ice itself as protection from the cold. Ambassador Nira sat in the observation room and stared at the screen with her mouth slightly open. The humans had been in the chamber for 8 hours. They had built a home, and they were just getting started. The hours passed slowly inside the igloo. The three humans established a routine that kept them alive and kept them sane. They slept in shifts, 2 people resting while one stayed awake to watch for problems. The person on watch would move around the small space, doing exercises to keep blood flowing, checking the walls for any signs of damage, making sure the ventilation hole at the top remained clear. Jake carved a small hole near the ceiling during the first night. Without it, the carbon dioxide from their breathing would build up inside the sealed space and slowly poison them. With the hole, fresh air could flow in while the warm air stayed trapped below. Lisa smoothed the interior walls until they were almost polished. Rough snow walls would drip as they warmed, soaking everything inside. Smooth walls would stay frozen on the surface while still providing insulation. It was a small detail, but small details meant the difference between life and death. Sam was quiet for most of the first day, watching and thinking. He studied the way heat moved through the space. He noticed how their breath created tiny currents of air that swirled near the ceiling. He observed how the snow beneath them compacted under their weight, becoming denser and more insulating over time. By the 20th hour, the interior of the igloo had stabilized at a temperature just above freezing. It was still cold enough to see their breath, but it was 50 degrees warmer than the frozen hell outside. The humans could survive at this temperature indefinitely. The alien watchers were amazed. Messages flew between worlds as scientists and philosophers tried to understand what they were seeing. The humans had not just survived the first 20 hours. They had made themselves comfortable. They had turned a death trap into a home. But Sam was not satisfied with merely surviving. He had been thinking about something since before they entered the chamber. A memory from his childhood, a skill his grandfather had taught him during those long winters on the frozen lakes of Minnesota. He began to work on his project around the 24th hour. First, he carved a small bowl from a block of ice. He used his fingers to shape it, smoothing the interior until it was almost perfectly round. The cold bit at his hands, but he kept working, warming his fingers against his body when they grew too numb. Next, he gathered materials. He pulled loose threads from the hem of his thin garment, rolling them between his palms until they formed a small bundle. He asked Lisa and Jake to do the same, collecting every tiny fiber they could find without damaging the clothing that kept them warm. The bundle of threads grew slowly. Sam added lint from seams and loose fibers from worn spots. After 2 hours of careful work, he had a small pile of dry tinder about the size of a golf ball. Jake asked him what he was doing. Sam explained that he was going to make fire. Jake and Lisa exchanged looks. Making fire in a room made of ice seemed impossible. The temperature was still below freezing. They had no matches, no lighter, no tools of any kind. All they had was ice and snow and the clothes on their backs. Sam just smiled and kept working. He shaped a thin rod from a strip of fabric that he had twisted and frozen until it was almost rigid. He curved a longer piece into a bow shape, wrapping the rod around the string. He carved a small depression into a flat piece of ice and placed his tinder bundle next to it. Then he began to work the bow. The technique was called a bow drill, and it was one of the oldest fire-starting methods known to humanity. The bow would spin the rod. The rod would create friction against the flat surface. The friction would create heat, and if everything went perfectly, that heat would eventually be enough to ignite the tinder. But everything had to go perfectly. The process required incredible patience and precise technique. Most people who tried it in warm conditions failed. Trying it in a frozen chamber seemed like madness. Sam worked the bow back and forth with slow, steady movements. He was not trying to create fire quickly. He was trying to create fire at all. Every stroke had to be perfect. Every movement had to be controlled. The watching galaxy could not believe what they were seeing. The alien scientists had calculated that creating fire through friction in these conditions was theoretically possible, but the margin for error was so small that no rational being would attempt it. It would take hours of perfect technique with no guarantee of success. Sam did not seem to care about what was rational. He just kept working. Lisa sat next to him, blocking the small air currents that might disrupt his work. Jake watched the entrance tunnel, making sure no cold air was flowing in to steal their precious warmth. Hours passed. Sam's arms ached, his hands cramped. But he kept the rhythm steady, kept the pressure constant, kept the bow moving back and forth in that ancient pattern. At the 36th hour, a tiny wisp of smoke rose from the friction point. Sam did not react. He kept working, feeding that tiny ember with more friction, coaxing it to grow. A minute passed. Another. The smoke became thicker. Lisa leaned in close, ready to transfer the ember to the tinder bundle. Sam gave one final push with the bow, then lifted the rod away. A small coal glowed orange in the depression he had carved. It was barely the size of a grain of rice, but it was the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen. Lisa gently scooped the coal into the tinder bundle. She cupped her hands around it and blew softly, feeding it oxygen, nurturing it like a living thing. The bundle began to smoke. Then a tiny flame appeared, orange and yellow and impossibly warm. Sam had created fire, in a room made of ice, with nothing but fabric and patience. The galaxy went silent. Then the messages began to flood the communication channels. Confusion, disbelief, awe. But Sam was not finished. He fed the small flame carefully, adding more threads and fibers until it burned steadily in the carved ice bowl. The ice beneath the flame melted slightly, but the surrounding cold kept it from spreading. He had created a small, contained heat source. He looked at Lisa and asked her to bring him some clean snow. Lisa scooped snow into a second ice bowl. Sam positioned it over the flame, holding it steady with hands that no longer shook. The snow began to melt. The water began to warm. Steam rose from the surface. Jake reached into a fold of his garment and produced a small handful of dried herbs. He had taken them from a plant in the station's botanical garden before they entered the chamber. No one had said they could not bring anything in. They had only said that the chamber would not provide anything. He dropped the herbs into the steaming water. At the 41st hour of the ice trial, the three humans sat in their handmade igloo around a small fire burning in a bowl of ice, drinking hot tea from cups carved out of frozen water. The broadcast showed the image to every corner of the galaxy. Three warm figures, surrounded by cold, holding steaming cups and smiling. Ambassador Nira stared at the screen with tears running down her silver-blue face. She had lived for 200 years. She had seen wonders beyond counting, but she had never seen anything like this. The humans had not just survived the cold, they had made it serve them. They had turned death into comfort and despair into hope, and they still had 49 hours left to go. The remaining hours of the ice trial passed in quiet comfort. The three humans maintained their routine, sleeping in shifts, keeping the fire alive, melting snow for drinking water. They talked about their lives back on Earth. They shared stories about the people they loved and the places they missed. They laughed at jokes that only made sense to humans. The watching galaxy could not look away. Species who had mocked the humans before the trial now sat in stunned silence. The Velkari ambassador, who had bet that humans would last 20 minutes, refused to leave the observation room. He watched every hour, every minute, trying to understand how these soft, fragile creatures had done what his own fire-born people could not. The Drenith representative sent a personal message to Ambassador Nira, asking her to explain how the humans stayed so calm. His people were known for their mental strength, but even the strongest Drenith had panicked in the ice trial. The cold had broken their will before it broke their bodies. Nira replied that she did not fully understand it herself, but she had a theory. The humans were not trying to defeat the cold. They were not fighting it or resisting it or pretending it did not exist. They had accepted the cold as a fact of their situation and then simply asked themselves what they could do with that fact. It was a way of thinking that most species had never considered. Most beings saw obstacles as enemies to overcome. Humans seemed to see obstacles as raw materials to use. At the 89th hour, the chamber door began to glow. The trial was almost over. The humans had done what no other species had ever done. They had survived the ice trial with time to spare. Jake looked around their small shelter one last time. The walls were smooth and solid. The fire burned steadily in its ice bowl. 2 cups of tea sat cooling near the entrance. They had made this place. They had built it with their own hands from nothing but frozen water and determination. He felt a strange sadness at the thought of leaving. This igloo had been their home for 90 hours. It had kept them alive when everything outside was trying to kill them. It felt wrong to just abandon it. Lisa seemed to understand what he was feeling. She placed her hand on his shoulder and told him that the shelter would still be here after they left. It would stand as proof of what humans could do. It would be waiting for the next species who wanted to learn. Sam put out the fire carefully, making sure no embers remained. He smoothed the ice bowl with his fingers, leaving it clean and ready for someone else to use. Then he crawled through the entrance tunnel for the last time and stepped out into the frozen chamber. The cold hit him immediately, but it felt different now. It was no longer an enemy. It was no longer a threat. It was just cold, and Sam had learned that cold could be useful. The chamber door opened fully, and warm air rushed in from the corridor beyond. Ambassador Nira stood in the doorway with tears streaming down her silver-blue face. Behind her, dozens of alien beings had gathered to witness the moment. The three humans walked out of the ice trial chamber with steady steps and calm expressions. They were tired. They were hungry. But they were alive and unbroken. The crowd parted before them. Beings of every shape and size stared at the humans with wonder and respect. Some bowed their heads. Others made gestures of honor that the humans did not recognize but understood. Ambassador Nira approached them first. Her 4 hands were trembling, and her voice was thick with emotion. She told them that in 12,000 years, no species had passed the ice trial. Most did not last a single day. The best had managed a few hours of suffering before the cold claimed them. But these 3 humans had built a home. They had made fire from nothing. They had heated water and made tea in a room of frozen death. Jake shrugged and said that where he came from, they called that surviving. It was nothing special. Nira shook her head. She said that it was very special. It was perhaps the most special thing she had ever seen. Other species had tried to fight the cold, or resist it, or outlast it. The humans had done something no other species had thought to do. They had made friends with it. A deep humming sound filled the corridor. The ancient walls of the architect's station began to glow with patterns of light that had not been seen for millions of years. The station's systems were waking up, responding to an event that their creators had designed them to recognize. A holographic figure appeared in the air above the crowd. It was tall and slender, with features that were almost human but not quite. It spoke in a language older than the stars, and the translation systems struggled to keep up. The message was simple. The trial of worth was never about strength or endurance or intelligence. It was about something more important. It was about the ability to adapt, the ability to see an obstacle and transform it into an opportunity, the ability to look at a problem and find a solution that no one else had considered. 47 species had entered the ice trial looking for ways to survive the cold. They had seen ice as an enemy to be feared. They had seen snow as a weapon that would destroy them. And they had died because they could not imagine any other way of seeing. One species had entered the ice trial looking for ways to use the cold. They had seen ice as a building material. They had seen snow as insulation. They had seen frozen water as cups and bowls and fuel for fire. They had not survived the cold. They had thrived in it. The holographic figure turned to face the 3 humans directly. Its ancient eyes seemed to look right through them. Species 48, designated human, had passed the trial of worth. Full membership in the Galactic Concord was granted. All rights and privileges of member species were now extended to Earth and its people. But there was more. The figure announced that humanity had been given a special designation. They were not just members of the galactic community. They were now officially classified as a guardian species. Their role was to teach others what they knew. Their purpose was to show the galaxy that obstacles could become opportunities, that death traps could become homes, that the impossible was just another problem waiting to be solved. The crowd erupted in sounds that might have been cheering in 100 different languages. Ambassador Nira embraced the humans with all 4 of her arms, laughing and crying at the same time. Lisa looked at Jake. Jake looked at Sam. Sam looked at the ice shavings still melting on his hands and smiled quietly. They had come to this place expecting to fight for their lives. They had found something better. They had found a way to show the universe what it meant to be human. As they walked back toward the ship that would take them home, Sam turned to Jake and asked if they could keep the teacups. Jake laughed and said he did not see why not. They had made them, after all. It would be a shame to leave them behind. Ambassador Nira heard the exchange and smiled. She had a feeling that humans would be keeping a lot of things that the galaxy had not planned on giving away. That was simply what humans did. They looked at the universe and saw not what it was, but what it could become. The galaxy would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be.